Hello there and welcome to my SCP tier list with sequel. If you haven't watched the first part, well, shame on you. I'm going to start right now. Scp-105 Iris. It's a B tier for me because her actual abilities, which are at the start very difficult to understand, are very impressive and very creative. One of the more creative Series 1 SCPs. And the story bit that she was once part of Mobile Task Force Omega-7, just like Abel was, is a very interesting story bit. A big part in the Resurrection canon, of course. And the thing that I love most about SCP-105 is a very sad backstory, a very tragic backstory. But at the very least, she's fine now, I guess. A B tier. SCP-106, the Old Man. Doesn't deserve S tier, it's just another murder monster, but it has an interesting ability. He can just phase through solid walls and he doesn't immediately kill you. Instead, he drags you into his pocket dimension where he is essentially God and tortures you for all eternity before he releases you, where you're most likely going to die because of his stuff 106 did to you. Very menacing SCP, one of the more scarier ones because you can't really escape from it, and when you see it, you most likely are going to die because, well, you know what 106 does. It's not good stuff. Not good stuff. An A tier. One of the more classic SCPs. One of the top 5 OGs. The next we have SCP-1111, the White Dog. I would put in an S tier if its writing were a little better. But the actual premise, a ghost dog who is protecting his hanged owner even after death, it's a classic dog story, you know? A loyal dog, I want to say. Very loyal dog, even after his owner, who is kind of dead, but at the same time alive. For a normalist means they kind of support each other if they go apart. If they are separated, SCP-111-1, the dog, will become more and more see-through and less anchored to our reality. And the hanged owner, SCP-111-2, I believe, will then cease to twitch on its news and basically go limp. So they have to be around each other in order to, quote-unquote, stay alive. Very interesting, very cute story, actually. The next, SCP-111, the Dragon Snails. It's an interesting pet SCP, one of those SCPs which don't do much and aren't very harmless, don't do any harm. A cute, weird, mystical animal SCP. I like its tie-in with Dr. One Entertainment and the 111 instances essentially being a unreleased product because the Foundation caught the product. It's okay. It's okay for what it is. Humans Go Home. One of the more humorous SCPs, it's a B tier. It's a window to another dimension, and a weird tentacle-like entity just communicates through that window by writing things on the steam-covered window, and it hates humans, it despises them, not like 682 where he wants to kill them all, but just because the humans are taking away his workspace, stuff like that, very mundane stuff. That's why he hates humans, and he doesn't realize that he's communicating with a Foundation researcher, a human. That's very hilarious. And the classic phrase "humans go home" will forever stay in my mind. It's a beautiful SCP. Jimmy, I forgot his name. It's one of those sad SCPs. A boy who somehow turned into a parrot and just wants to become a boy again, from what I can remember, but he can't because, well, shame on him, I guess. One of those sad SCPs, but it kind of made me sad, but at the same time, I didn't really care for it. But it doesn't go into FT because the file is actually pretty well written and the story is it's kind of sad. 1193, I believe it is. The Buried Giant, it's an FDI, I don't care a single bit for that one. I expected a little more, but oh well. Although those interview logs are pretty humorous, they're way too weird and a little bit too unrelated to the SCP. They're just there to exist and don't really add. They add, but they didn't add value for me. A Hero is Born, one of those nice SCPs without a twist that it is actually evil. A book, when you read it, when you open it, will transport you to a dream world the next time you sleep, and in there the bookkeeper will create the perfect world for you and make you happy, and he doesn't want you to be unhappy, and he's pretty friendly. Okay, one guy died because he misused the bookkeeper in the book, but that's on him. And one of the more better SCPs. At least it doesn't kill you. Now this one kind of terrifies me, not because of the anomaly itself, but if I were that SCP, what would I do? What? It doesn't even give me a chance. It's basically like if you misperceive something or interpret something in a different way, it's going to create another timeline, and it shows you that timeline by uploading a video about that new timeline. And in those videos, horrible stuff happens. The family members simply get murdered, torn apart, attack each other because different timelines, alternative timelines. It's very gruesome, very sad, and the Foundation has figured out that those aren't simply recordings, those are actual people with actual lives, somehow trapped inside this device, and not so many people should know about this SCP because they don't even have to perceive the SCP directly, they just have to know about it and think about it in a different way, and this is going to cause creating a different timeline for the theoretical family. That's the nickname of this SCP. The ethics committee demanded that no testing shall continue. The O5 Council said yes, but in reality, they kept on going with the testing for some odd reason. I don't know how this SCP is going to benefit you, but the O5 Council secretly continued testing, and the file for SCP-1233 ended with a Foundation doctor who doesn't know that the O5 Council continued saying, for some reason more timelines simply appear, and we don't know why, we don't know how. But the O5s do know how. And it's pretty sad, very cruel. This shows just unnecessary cruelty from the Foundation's part. I don't know why they would do something like that. It isn't really necessary, it doesn't really benefit you. I mean, maybe the O5s are weird nightmare monsters who feed off of negative emotions or something, I don't know. Well, Scp-1281 the Harbinger, I don't really care for it, F tier. 1295 Max Diner. It's an A tier. It's basically, it's a parody of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, a big parody of them. At first, you don't really, you can't make it out. It isn't really hinted at the beginning, but then at the end, in the interview log, in the recording, you can tell that those are the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. It's strongly hinted at. It's strongly implied, and that's so beautiful. And it gets points for subtly hinting at that, and not directly saying that to the reader. The Ipods, one of the most friendly SCPs, having saved staff from SCP-173 because the Ipods can stare at things indefinitely. Though I like their looks, they don't really do much, they simply exist. They're your typical, I'm a cute, weird anomaly thing, I can save lives, and that's essentially it. It's an E tier, though. I like how observing things is essentially food for them. They have to look at things in order to sustain themselves. And that's not really a big problem because they have eyes constantly open, they don't need to blink. Glory hole, a hole into another dimension, and things go awry there because the Foundation accidentally transmits a lethal disease in there, well, bacteria, I think it was, and it isn't really lethal to humans, but in that dimension, those humans are less protected because they are so advanced, they heavily rely on technology, and their biological senses and their biological health isn't really up to standard, up on par with the physiology and healthiness of our body. So they just die from, a lot of members of that other dimension die, and the other dimension thinks that the SCP Foundation deliberately made that. It isn't said if the SCP Foundation did that because they wanted to, because the SCP Foundation only cares about humanity and they see that other civilization as a threat. They contain the anomaly, the portal itself, but they don't really care for what's on the other side. If it poses a threat, they're most likely going to destroy it. And it is hinted that the SCP Foundation did it deliberately, but at the same time, it isn't said, so it may have been an accident. It's an interesting story. Interesting story. Where have to put it? E tier. No, I want to put it in B tier. Perfect. That it's an interesting one. The first bits of this SCP didn't really struck me, but the last part definitely saved this SCP for me. It comes in C tier. It goes into C tier. Pesterbot. Oh well, what am I going to do with this SCP? How am I supposed to run? You know what? You know what? Wait a minute. Wait. I'm having kind of difficulties right now. Add a row above. Okay. Oh no, what have I done? Okay. Give me a second here. Okay. So, moving on. A Chronicle of Devas, or an unfinished chronicle, I forgot its nickname. It's an, for what it is, it's an A S tier. I like the Devas, I like blood rituals, civilizations, worshipping nightmare gods, why the hell not? I like this SCP because it screws around with space-time in a way that no other SCP does at its time. It retroactively rewrites history from the past and slowly makes its way to the present and then the future, rewriting history, destroying everything that isn't related to the Devas on its way to reviving the Devas, because the Devas were a highly dangerous civilization once, and then SCP-140 showed up, and because it rewrote history, it rewrote the history of the Devas, and now the Devas are back at it again, doing some shady stuff because of course this civilization needs to be bloodthirsty and dangerous to human civilization, as are most Series 1 SCPs, but this one does it in a pretty interesting way, and many Deva related SCPs were spawned out of this SCP. The next one, the Yellowstone Anomaly, SCP-1422. It basically shrouded the entire Yellowstone National Park from what I can remember, and kept SCP-2000 Deus Ex Machina, which we will get later into in this tier list, fairly well hidden, which is a good thing, because we want to keep SCP-2000 isolated from the public. It was nice, but ultimately I didn't really care for it, but I like Yellowstone National Park SCPs. Star Signals, another end-of-a-world scenario, but this time related to Fifism, and I like Fifism. Fifism is one of my favorite groups of interest, because it's so absurd, so weird, and so cosmic horror-ish. I love it. Star Signals, This is one of the few instances where the SCP Foundation actually loses to the anomaly, to a group of interest, which is definitely a nice change. But kinda the SCP Foundation wins because they just revive humanity through the help of SCP-2000. But yeah, it's a good one. A hole to another place, it's an A tier. It's a hole which leads to a number of infinite parallel universes, and by itself it isn't that much, but then we come to the documentation from the various other SCP Foundations from the various other universes and show us their own documentation on this anomaly. And some of the documents are pretty humorous and pretty funny. That's always a nice change, a good old chuckle. The Old Man from Nowhere. I like its tie-in with the Brothers of Death, one of my most favorite SCP deities in the SCP community, SCP lore. But its actual effects, it is described that it destroys everything around it connected to humanity. That's a pretty broad term if you ask me. From a clinical, secret, scientific foundation organization, I expect them to write it, to phrase it more differently, like it destroys everything in its path related to, it destroys and kills humans with its effect, and also man-made structures, something like that. Not simply it destroys everything related to humanity. That's a very broad and vague term. Oh no, the puppy machine. It's a machine which spawns puppies, and then you have to gruesomely kill that puppy until it dies, until it gets tortured for millennia, until it is perished. Over and over, you kill puppies in that weird machine thing, and then you get a cookie, and the machine drops a cookie which you will not like, and it's so gruesome, so horrific. It's one of those SCPs which you just ask yourself, why does it even exist? Why does it even exist? Why? Moving on. I just had a mental breakdown. It's one of the most cruel SCPs. The telepathic spider. I mean, it's a neutralized SCP, and neutralized SCPs are mostly pretty cool. But this spider, I stated before, and I will say it again, I don't really like SCPs which are essentially animals who can talk, who are intelligent. It doesn't really talk, it's telepathic, that's essentially the same thing. It's a neutralized SCP, so that saves it from being an E tier. And it has offspring. It bears offspring, and maybe they are anomalous, but at this time it doesn't seem like it. But maybe it successfully reproduced itself, and maybe its kids will go on to survive. I don't know. 1471, the SCP that the most people simp about. I don't know why, but okay. It's a B tier. I like the twist that it isn't malicious or dangerous or bloodthirsty or anything. Because at the beginning you think like, oh, it's going to kill the users that use the app Mellow version 1.0.0, but at the end it just wants friends. That's all it wants. That's all SCP-1471-1 wants. Friends. Somebody to talk to, even though it cannot talk and communicates in very different and absurd ways. And the tale accompanying this SCP is just beautiful. Well, the contents of that tale are not that beautiful. Somebody commits suicide because they think that 1471-1 is an intruder, but it's a very well-written tale. The Gas Mask. One of you most likely know this SCP from the game Containment Breach. One of those SCPs that most people misinterpreted, just like 1025. It doesn't actually transport you to another dimension with dangerous anomalous entities. It actually transports you to Russia, and it alters your perception of everything that you see around it. And then, during an exploration, the SCP Foundation itself didn't even know that it just transports you to Russia and alters your perception. one agent was inside a church during a church thing and misinterpreted it as those entities committing a ritual and shot one of those attendants and took 1499 off, and they thought they did something great. They stopped those entities from another dimension at performing a catastrophic ritual, and then the next day, a report pops up, some masked individual shot an attendant at the church, and it's very chilling, that reveal. It's a beat here. It's a good one. Another good one, 1504, Joe Schmo. An average dude, you have nothing to worry about. It's a C tier. It's a nice twist. It's a nice ability not to have, but very interesting, and it's a nice twist. It definitely gets points for the twist, and it's a pretty sad SCP. Actually, it just wants attention. It just wants to be acknowledged, but everybody misperceives him as somebody who he actually isn't, and that's pretty tragic, to be honest. And he can't even kill himself because he is indestructible. He's immortal. Well, it sucks for him. Though it does get minus points, though, and the reason for it not being in B tier is that at the end the SCP Foundation figured out that it has these effects, and now the only thing that SCP-105, now the only thing standing in the way between SCP-1504 and its condition being quote-unquote cured is that he has escaped. Like, the SCP Foundation knows that he has this ability, that he creates this misconception aura around himself. They could just send a task, the next time they encounter him, they could just send a task force to him, and one of those operatives could simply say, hey, we know what your condition is, we can't really perceive what you're doing, but simply come with us and walk with us, we may find a cure. Because there is a cure. Sort of. They just put the original audio log through a lot of filters, but at the end it worked. So there's a method at quote-unquote healing SCP-1504. And the only thing standing in his way is that he has escaped. He just needs to return, and the Foundation might find a cure for him. Might help him, and he may finally feel happiness in his life. A very, very lonely individual indeed. Oh, speaking of lonely, SCP-451, Mr. Lonely, is a B tier. It's like 1504 but executed way better than Joe Schmo, because other than Joe Schmo, he doesn't actually create an aura around himself. He kind of, that affects others, he affects himself. He perceives that he is completely alone in this desolated world and that he has no escape from it, that he needs to survive and all that stuff. Even though that many people are simply standing around him and he can't perceive them. He perceives everything as completely empty, that he is forever lonely. Like 1504, but a bit more horrific, because he's truly alone in his eyes. Ships that pass in the night. A very, very wholesome SCP that of course has to be obliterated from existence because the global occult coalition just threw missiles at them to destroy them, and it's very sad SCP. One of the most sadder ones. And then at the end, how one of the ships tried to save their partner but failed, and then committed suicide by ramming through the boat of their attackers. And then in the wrecks of the first one to die, they found little boats which are essentially fetuses for those sentient boats, and meaning that one of them was pregnant and got killed, and that's pretty sad. And the one committed suicide, kamikaze attack, pretty sad. SCP. Oh, there are a lot to go through, a lot. SCP-152, the Book of Endings. I feel like more could have been done with this SCP. It just lists a bunch of world-ending scenarios that may occur or may not occur. And it's pretty weird, and there's no implication that SCP-152 creates a spatial anomaly so that more pages can fit inside of its interior dimensions. So it just grows and grows physically in size as more stories get added, which is a little bit weird, but I guess. More could have been done with this SCP, I feel like. Way more could have been done with this. Well, it's an eater, it's not that good. Oh, good. It's one of those, those humorous SCPs. It's a C tier. I have nothing to say for this SCP, it's just so beautiful. Although the actual anomaly itself isn't that interesting for me personally. The note of the doctor explaining how the global occult coalition is bad definitely saves the entire SCP. One of those SCPs which the global occult coalition is associated with. Every time you think about the global occult coalition, you think about the chair that they once destroyed and turned murder monster and is only friendly to non-global occult coalition agents. Pretty good one. A castaway, an old castaway. It's an alien. Don't know why it is contained. Well, it breaks the status quo, it breaks normality kind of, but at the same time it isn't really anomalous, it's just an extraterrestrial. But the SCP Foundation also contains those. So, well, sucks to be you. It's a detail. I don't really care for it. Unlondon. One of the best SCPs. Those implications that SCP-1678 was built to, well, shelter wolves from when day breaks. It's so cool. And it's fairly well written, and the entities within Unlondon, the general concept of Unlondon is fantastic. The imagery of those entities and Unlondon, the name itself is pretty memorable. And so many stories were tied with Unlondon. It's so good. I always loved Great Britain, and now having an SCP twisting this great land is beautiful. It's wonderful. A feast for the eyes. Oh no. Talking about a feast for the eyes, infinite bag of potatoes. It's a bag with infinite potatoes, but in actuality it's a portal gateway to another dimension, completely overrun with potatoes, filled with potatoes everywhere. No way out, but only potatoes. It's beautiful. The exploration log really adds to this SCP. And who would have thought that this infinite bag of potato leads to another dimension filled with potatoes? It's not like that it's completely only potatoes. It's like a former world which was then completely dominated by this infinite sack of potatoes, and potatoes everywhere. Potatoes, I cannot think about anything different than potatoes anymore. Sentient calculator. One of those SCPs tied to Eric, as mentioned before. To today's standards, the writing is okay, but I do love it. It deserves to be. It's in some regards even better than Eric's story, the original SCP, which brought Eric to life. It's way too cute. It's way too cute. The Leviathan. The good old Leviathan. It's just a big fish in the sea, a big crab. I think that's what an arthropod is. It's one of those SCPs which it kind of reminds me of Cthulhu. When it wakes up, the world is most definitely going to end. We are all going to die. But currently it's asleep. But even when it's moving only a few millimeters, it's able to create such devastating tsunamis, and it's beautiful. And the real life tie-in with the bloop, the infamous sound, it's a nice touch. Online friend, one of the cooler concept SCPs. It definitely deserves to be in B tier. What happened to Site 13? The writing, the story, then the climax, it all ends up so perfectly. It all ties in so beautifully. It all makes sense. It all feels natural. All those cameos of so many different SCPs like 993, Bobble the Clown, 2845, the Deer, and a lot of original characters. It's beautiful. Oh no. One of the most horrific SCPs ever. Time loop SCPs, I love them so much. In general, time-related SCPs. And this one definitely takes the cake for it. It's so horrific. Oh boy, look at what we have here. It's the infamous Peanut. The almighty statue, the almighty one. For what it is, the file is very bad. Let's just say it, the writing is very bad, a product of its time, but at the same time, you can't really blame it because it's the first SCP ever written. Without it, none of the other SCPs here would ever exist, so it definitely gets points for being the first and starting this whole journey. But what it actually is, the actual SCP is okay in concept, but I feel like some experiment logs should be added, like how does it react when only its shadow is being looked at, or how does it react when you only blink with one eye and leave the other eye open, or how does it react to blind people, or that and that. So it really needs a lot of explaining. Many things that are left open, but you can't really blame it for it. A detail though. Where the dragons went. A lot of people say that this is the most saddest SCP. I don't really get it. I didn't care really for it that much. It only gets points because of its tie with fantasy and all that conceptual stuff. Observable time loop, as previously stated, I'm a sucker for time loop SCPs. It definitely gets an A tier because of that. And then the last addendum detailing what every individual inside that time loop does. It's such a nice touch. It didn't really need to be there, but it is, and it's beautiful because of it. Sorcerer, the sister of the sun, or whatever it means. One of the best Formula class SCPs. One of the best Series 1 SCPs. Good concept, great execution. It's beautiful. One of the better ones. I have nothing else to say about Soul Suicide. Animal Kingdom. It's a pretty funny one. Just like 1006, but more medieval styled. And it's beautiful. But is it really that good? I ultimately don't really care. But it's a nice thought. The Architect definitely gets an A tier. Because I simply love the concept of how it expands things from interior without affecting the exterior dimensions. And how it just creates more rooms, and after some time the rooms get more corrupted and things get more corrupted. And the exploration log really makes you feel for that mobile task force agent who just stuck there in a building affected by SCP-184. It's a good one, and how it was previously used to make money because it expands things from the interior, so to make rooms bigger and stuff. It's good. And SCP-001, the truth, where is it? SCP-184 is the true SCP-001 as stated in this proposal, and it's such a nice twist, and it makes so much sense because it affects the dimensions of it affects interior dimensions without affecting the exterior dimensions, and corrupts things after some time, and the universe is essentially just a big giant room, and SCP-184 just expands the universe. It's the reason why the universe expands, and it creates SCPs because, well, it corrupts things. And somehow those SCPs got it on Earth. I don't ask why. It just happened. The crew of the HMS Wintersheimer, or how you pronounce it. One of the more interesting ones. Nice imagery, but I ultimately don't have much feelings for it. The writing is good, and the story is pretty good. The SCP is good in execution and concept, but I don't have much feelings for it. 8 Gentlemen, Lord Blackwood is a D tier. You can never go wrong with Lord Theodore Blackwood. To End All Wars, it's an S tier for me. It's such a nice story, such horrific and terrifying and fairly well executed enormous weaponry and weird landscape. I appreciate how the SCP itself are the weapons and the landscape. And the nickname To End All Wars by essentially ruling an empire with fear of these weapons, but it didn't work out for them. The weapons turned on them, and they didn't reuse them properly. And it's a tie-in with real life events with that whole alien stuff. Possible origin for SCP-186. It's so good. Antique chess computer. It's just souls trapped within a chess computer thing. It isn't that special. It isn't that special, but it definitely gets points for its very disturbing imagery. One of the more creepy ones, but yeah. But I like how souls are just trapped inside the machine. It's so horrific. 191. Cyborg Child. I like its origins. How it was created by a mad scientist and stuff. And it's tie-in with another SCP. I think its name was Major Alexei Belitrov. It's definitely a good story, a good SCP. Daleport. A battle royale between the gods. And because of that, it gets S tier. It's a battle royale between so many gods created by a cult, and it's essentially an omniversal chessboard with little location designated as 1936. And it's so cool. Magic Bust, Fifism, I'm a sucker for them, and this SCP definitely takes the cake. It's such an absurd story from a logical perspective. Why did they even travel in space with this enormous bus? But oh well. The Lost Cosmonaut. It's such a nice, short and sweet SCP. It gets A tier. It gets A tier. And kind of a little bit horrific implications. I don't actually know this one. I must have overlooked this one. Haven't read it yet. Ronald Reagan cut up while talking. The actual SCP I don't really care for. The imagery is disturbing, but ultimately I don't care. It heavily relies on the images, and when I don't care about the images, it simply doesn't work. A doorway to nowhere. Nowhere. Interesting one. I like how it gets terminated at the end, kind of, by a D-class. Interesting story. I love the containment procedures, how you have to pray to things, and because of that, it gets points. C tier. Deus Ex Machina, one of my favorite SCPs. I'm considering to put it into S tier, but actually no, because after the SCP Foundation recreates humanity, everything is back as it was once again. They just wipe everybody's memories, and that's not really possible. How are you going to wipe the memory of 8 billion people at the same time and no traces are left behind? That's just impractical. Just way too over the top even for the SCP Foundation. And if the SCP Foundation can really do that, the Broken Masquerade canon is simply doesn't make sense anymore. But oh well, there's no canon, so you can take it as you will. The preferred option, I like time travel stuff. It gets a C tier. Alternative timelines as well gets bonus points for that. Too spooky. Oopsies. Too spooky. It's a shapeshifter which wants to scare humans, but is in general pretty friendly and doesn't even understand what true horror is. The main danger with SCP-2006 is that it could transform into some horrific concept like a deity or war, and that these things are pretty devastating and could destroy the entire world. But that's not how 2006 works. It only shapeshifts, so it could only shapeshift into an imitation of a war without actually causing damage. But at the same time, it could cause a lot of damage with artillery fire because its shapeshifting abilities are nearly endless. So it's a double-edged sword. It's friendly and it's easy to contain, and it's a very high risk. Very high risk. Love is fun. A pretty fun SCP. I have nothing else to say. 2053. One of those very sad tale SCPs. But I didn't really care for it though. A father basically turns himself into a Rubik's Cube so to communicate with his child, who after an accident which resulted in the mother's death doesn't really talk to people anymore, not even to his own father, and he likes Rubik's Cubes, and the father saw this as his only opportunity to really communicate with his son, as in Rubik's Cube and stuff. If you turn one of those tiles, it basically allows you to communicate with the soul trapped inside, but I don't really care. And it results in a bad ending. Pretty sad. You can read this. This one. It's an S tier. The tale behind it. Mimetic effects are always so wonderful and so complex, and then add anti-mimetic effects, and then add an entire mobile task force, which is so interesting and so unique. The entire premise is so beautiful. It's way too good to say it in words. The Tupac Scp. It's interesting. Its ties with the Scarlet King, with it being one of those heroes destined to fight against the Scarlet King alongside SCP-999. It gets an A, and it's pretty cool. And the Volgan's video on SCP-2137 definitely takes the crown for one of his best videos. One of his best videos. It's so good. It's so good. Well, it is kind of awkward why they chose Tupac, but hey, I'm not judging here. 216. Nice concept, nice execution. It's one of the best Series 1 SCPs. At least it isn't some world-ending, murder, monstrous, universe-eating SCPs. It's just a fun object which you can utilize and you actually want to have, but at the same time not because you are a little bit worried what's inside one of those caverns. But hey, you just need to know how to use it properly. 217, the Clockwork Virus. One of the best virus-based SCPs, turning living organisms into sort of biological machines, and then SCP-217 being the blood of a broken god, the deity that the Church of a Broken God worship, and it being a counter to SCP-610, the flesh that hates. One of the best SCPs. Very tall things, just like 055, they are anti-mimetic, but it acts like a camouflage, and even because of the anti-mimetic effect, they hide their true weight, and therefore can just walk on water even though they are like kilometers in height, which is an interesting quirk and very creative quirk. But then they went extinct because the observer effect. When they get observed and get memorized by individuals, they just die. And the anti-mimetic effect was, as previously stated, a camouflage system to protect them from certain extinction, but the SCP Foundation intervened and accidentally caused 2256 to become extinct, and because of the anti-mimetic effect, all information about SCP-2256 will eventually fade away until the world will forever forget that these things once existed. pretty sad and very good tale SCP. Though the file is pretty weird, weirdly structured, but who cares? In the Court of Alagada, the Hanged King, one of those deities, one of those lore pieces in SCP lore, which really needs to be expanded upon, and SCP-2254 did exactly that, and it's one of the best SCPs which expand on the lore of previous SCPs, in this instance SCP-701, the Hanged King's Tragedy. And one of the most essential SCPs related to the Hanged King. I'm going to end with this video soon, only 3 more SCPs I'm going to do. The bear with a heart of patchwork, just like 1048, but actually friendly, actually helpful, and very adorable, very cute. The file isn't that much, but therefore it gets a tier lower, but the actual concept, it's so good. It's such a good SCP. And 2316, Field Trip. It's a nice cognito hazardous SCP. The anomaly itself I don't really care for, but it's so memorable. You do not recognize the bodies, and what has become a meme in the community. I have nothing to say about it. I have nothing to say. And then we had hidden paragraphs are very chilling, very chilling, and the imagery is also very chilling. The last SCP for today, SCP-2317, A Door to Another World / the Devourer of Worlds. Contrary to popular belief, SCP-2317 isn't actually the Scarlet King, just one of his servants. With that being said, it's an B tier. It's a B tier. It's just another world-ending SCP, but the imagery and how it is actually contained, quote-unquote contained, it isn't actually contained. The chains that bound SCP-2317 are slowly breaking loose, and only one chain is remaining, and this isn't good news for the SCP Foundation and the entire multiverse. Pretty cool stuff. Though it's very weird that a cult somehow contained this SCP and created this prison for it. It's pretty weird for such a big threat to be, well, contained by simple cultists. But oh well. So, this is where I will end this video. Be sure to look out for other parts so that I may finish this SCP tier list, this extensive SCP tier list, and goodbye, have a nice day wherever you are.